Welcome! In this series of videos, we will look at software add-ons for the PowerBasic Windows compiler. Today we will look again at the MyLittleGrid custom grid and how to configure columns in your grid. This was our application at the end of the last video. We have a dialog, and on that dialog is a MyLittleGrid. This grid we have configured to have 5 columns. Each alternate row of this grid is color banded. We have an ID column which is populated between the numbers 1 and 50, as we have 50 rows in our grid. What we're going to do today is to further enhance the grid by adding 2 extra columns, setting one column as a checkbox and one column as a drop-down list. We will also cover column formatting. So let's have a look at the code. As we're going to add 2 new columns, we need to change our grid constants at the beginning of the application. So we've increased the number of grid columns from 5 to 7, and we've added on the width of each of these columns to our constant for column widths. I've also added on 2 new named columns, a column called active and a column called employee num. So now that we've set those up, let's have a look at the dialog itself. As we've increased the number of columns, we are probably going to have to increase the size of the grid to allow all columns to be visible. So we'll add another 50 units onto the width of our dialog and our grid. If we run the application as it stands now, we'll see that our dialog is wider and the grid is wider. We can see the active column, but the employee number column is just slightly out of view. However, this isn't a concern because what I intend to do first of all is to make the employee number column invisible to the user. It will still be on the grid, however the user will not be able to see it. It's sometimes useful in grids to have an invisible column that you can put calculated values into. So that's what we're going to do first. So after the section where we've actually named each of the columns, we're going to add in a column type which is invisible to the user. So in order to make the employee number column invisible to the user, we're going to call a new function in our library, which is the hide a column function. This takes 2 parameters, the first being the grid handle and the second being the column number. If we try running that code now, we should see the employee number column disappear, which it does. However, hard-coding column numbers into these functions is probably not the best way to do it, especially if you need to add extra columns which offset your column numbers. So there's an additional function to extract the column number based on the grid headers, and that's what we're going to use now. This new function is getColumnNumber. It takes 2 parameters, the grid handle and the name of the column. This is a case-independent search, so it doesn't matter on the casing of your column name. If it finds the column name, in other words if the column name is greater than 0, then it will attempt to hide your column. So if we run that now, we will see it has exactly the same effect. So if we add a column name later between the surname and the department column, our code will still function. So now that we've managed to make a column invisible, what we're going to do next is we're going to center the very first column and lock it. Now currently we have our entire grid locked as read-only. So if we go into our callback function, our event handler, and we will comment out the line of code which marks the whole grid as read-only. So each cell in our grid will now be writable. As I said in the last video, there are a number of ways of actually doing things in MyLittleGrid. We can either mark the entire grid as read-only, and then unlock whatever cells we need to unlock, or we can do it by column. So we're going to do it by column here. So the first thing is to get the column number of our ID column, using the function we used a moment ago. And then we're going to call a new function in our library called formatColumn. This takes a number of parameters. It takes the grid handle, it takes the column number, it takes the type of centering. In this case we want to center it in the column as opposed to left or right. We can set optionally a colour for the column other than black, and we can say whether we want to lock or unlock the column. Normally when you're configuring a grid, you only set the columns once. So if we run this now, we will see that our ID column is now centered and all the text in the cells is blue. The column is locked and it cannot be edited, but every other cell in the grid is editable. So the next thing I want to do with this grid is I want to change the type of column for the active column. Currently it's a text box. Now I want to change this to make it a checkbox, so the person can be either active if it's ticked or not active if it's not ticked. So how do we change our column to format it as a checkbox? Well, as we did before, we will first pick up the column number. Having got the column number, we're going to use the format column function once more. The format column function has an optional parameter, which is either going to be true or false. If the optional parameter is true, then we're setting this column as being a checkbox. So if we run that now, we will see that the active column has indeed become a checkbox, and it is editable. Therefore, we can click on it and set the tick to ticked or not ticked. So our next task is to create a drop-down on one of the columns. I'm going to do this on the division column. So as before, we will pick up the column number using our getColumnNumber function. And as this is going to be a drop-down list, we need a list of values which the user can select from. So we'll create a local variable to contain our list. And our list is a simple, comma-delimited list of the names you want to appear in each element of the drop-down. And we'll use yet another new function in our library called formatGridDropdown. This takes a mere 3 parameters: the grid handle, the column number that we wish to make into a drop-down, and the list of values you want to appear on that drop-down. So if we run that code now, we will see that initially the division column appears to be unchanged. However, if we click on any cell within the division column, we will see that a drop-down gadget appears on the right-hand side of the column. And when you click on this, you get the list. The user can only select from the list. They cannot type anything into the box itself. So if you wish the user to be able to unselect a division, in other words, blank out the division name, you'll have to put an empty length string as one of the options on the list. And there, our last value is in fact blank. So that gives you a mechanism by which a user can remove a value from the drop-down. Another thing to note for features you get out of the box with MyAutoGrid is the ability to widen or narrow a column, just by selecting the column as you would in many common spreadsheets. So in summary, what we've seen today are a number of mechanisms by which we can format columns. We can center columns on the screen, we can change the colour of the data within the column, we can make the entire column locked or unlocked, we can make a column to be a checkbox, and we can make a column to be a drop-down list. What we'll cover in our next video is the ability to import data directly into our grid. But that's it for today. Thank you for watching.